Welcome back. In part 2, Luke and I discuss the esoteric connections and intersections with the figures of Blake and Ginsberg. We talk about the influence of Emmanuel Swedenborg and Gnosticism on the worldviews of both Blake and Ginsberg, how Ginsberg saw Buddhism and Gnosticism as being connected in a syncretic type way, and what contemporary artists could be viewed as, quote, carrying on the Blakean torch in our own popular culture. Okay, so we have laid a nice little foundation here with Blake and Ginsberg. So I'd like to now move on to talk about the esoteric connections to these two figures. So we know that Blake was influenced by Emmanuel Swedenborg, who lived from 1688 to 1772, looking at my notes here. Swedenborg also claimed to have had visions, spiritual insights, and communications with entities from other planets, even other, not just on a kind of like a spiritual realm in our sense of the word and on an earthly plane, but also in other planets and other galaxies, systems, and stuff.
So, you could almost see a science fiction connection.
Exactly. Yes.
Journey into space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Swedenborg claimed that the spiritual world is the quote-unquote real world, and that what happens here on Earth, our human experience here on Earth, is very succinctly put, a type of practice session for the real thing. But the practice is also important, though, because what you're doing here influences one's existence in the spirit world. So, with regard to Ginsberg, my question for you is anything known about whether or not Ginsberg was aware of Swedenborg's writings?
So, I haven't come across any, I may be wrong, I haven't come across any reference to Ginsberg reading Swedenborg, but he definitely would have been aware of Swedenborg. I mean, Ginsberg was very well read. I mean, this is something that I suppose this is another element to my work, is almost wanting to sort of show how, because I think Ginsberg has this reputation because of being so much connected to the counterculture and so much connected to a sort of a particular image of 60s counterculture, which is quite goofy in some ways. Actually, the holy goof was actually a phrase that Ginsberg used himself of himself as well. So, and there's the crazy photo of him at the Human Being in San Francisco, where he's kind of dancing around and just looking like a kind of total, mad hippie, really, And and that was very playful, very kind of childlike and element to 60s counterculture, and was a big part of Ginsberg, and was a big, that was something that and there's the connection with childhood and childlike elements is also a connection to Blake, because Blake's songs of innocence and of experience can be seen as works of children's literature as well in some respects. So anyway, I suppose what I'm trying to say is part of my work has been involved in almost wanting to kind of show that despite this way in which we might see Ginsberg as a sort of classic kind of goofy hippie kind of figure, and the connection with psychedelics and all the rest. Actually, he was a highly intellectual, highly very well read figure who really, really, knew his stuff and was continuously reading all sorts of different texts, whether literary or philosophical or religious texts. So I don't know whether he read much Swedenborg, but he definitely would have been aware of Swedenborg, and he, as I said, later in Ginsberg's life, especially from the sort of early 70s onwards, when he became a little bit more connected professionally with higher education, and where he taught at different universities and taught courses on Blake as well, Ginsberg would also have, he became increasingly knowledgeable about, the sort of academic perspective on Blake, as it were, and, would have known, even if he wasn't reading Swedenborg himself, he would have known about Swedenborg through kind of academic literature on Blake, as it were. So in that later period of his life, anyway. Yeah. But yeah, Swedenborg. I mean, Swedenborg. The relationship between. I'm not so much of an expert on the relationship between Swedenborg and Blake, but that is a very strong connection. So, and Blake had quite a complicated relationship with Swedenborg, where he was very interested in Swedenborg's work. And attended a meeting in London of the Swedenborgian group, the church, and then quite quickly kind of started to kind of see that it didn't quite seem to work for him. It wasn't quite that he started to find problems, I suppose, with Swedenborg's work at the same time that he was also clearly fascinated by it, because it did seem to, in a way, be quite similar to, I suppose, his own pre-existing perspective on things, and so Blake's work, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is this is the work that, as I said earlier, contains several of these kind of famous aphorisms, like the Doors of Perception and the Tigers of Wrath, various different aphorisms. Not all of them, but many of them come from Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And this work, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in some ways it actually references Swedenborg and mentions Swedenborg's name at different points in it, but is usually seen as, if anything, a kind of a satire on Swedenborg as much as a tribute, if you see what I mean. There's, as I said, that's a little bit, is not. There are other Blake scholars who are have more expertise in this than I do, but the relationship between Blake and Swedenborg is a complicated one for sure. But Ginsberg really, he read a lot of different esoteric and religious and philosophical texts, throughout his whole life. So I would not be at all surprised if he'd read Swedenborg sort of in the original as well, as opposed to sort of through Blake.
Yeah. And I guess just for my own curiosity, my own interest, that would be something that I would be like looking for if there are any scholars out there that are working on anything like that now. If they happen to be listening to this podcast, get in touch with me. I'd like to know. And I've also learned from reading your work that Ginsberg was also interested in Gnosticism. And in your article called Allen Ginsberg's Blakean Albion, I sensed a very Gnostic feel. Even though you weren't speaking directly about Gnosticism, I had this feel of Gnosticism in these words with regards to the terms used, such as awakening, trapped, the fall of Albion. And these terms suggested to me the quote unquote Gnostic situation of being, in the dark. You're trapped in this corrupted physical existence due to the fall of man, unable to see the light, need to be awakened to the truth, etc., etc. So, like I said, you weren't really specifically mentioning Gnosticism here, but if you could go into a little bit more detail about Ginsberg's interest in Gnosticism and how he used Gnostic themes in his own work. For example, you did write in the article with reference to a poem, Plutonian Ode, and there was a high, I think, a Gnostic connection there, Gnostic themes going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So this connection between Ginsberg and Gnosticism is something which I haven't published so much on, but I have spoken on at different conferences. So actually, at the ESWE conference, the European Society for Study of Western Esotericism conference in Amsterdam, whichever year that was. You'll know, living there, I'm sure.
That was 2019, I believe.
Yeah, so at that conference, I spoke on Ginsberg as student of Western esotericism, but largely, I was talking about Ginsberg as student of Gnosticism, and this is a kind of element that I've brought in to do, mentioned in different academic publications, but still haven't really had a chance to publish on it, although I've spoken about it. So yeah, I suppose I'm interested in the way in which I suppose we should start with the fact that Blake himself clearly is influenced by Gnosticism. And we haven't really spoken much about Blake's own mythopoetic system,
No, we
and
haven't.
Blake's own more kind of complex prophetic books, the ones which almost nobody read in his own time,
Yes.
basically, where uh, we can really, I mean, they are highly Gnostic in the sense that so Blake, for example, has a figure within his sort of self-created mythopoetic system, but which also intersects with Christianity. And Blake certainly considered himself to be a Christian, despite the fact that his poetry and his sort of self-created spiritual mythological system clearly has elements that are quite very far from kind of mainstream Christianity. This didn't stop
Right,
Blake
right.
still seeing himself absolutely as a Christian. But yeah, so Blake has a figure called Urizen within his mythology, and Urizen is basically he is basically the Gnostic demiurge Yaldabaoth. I mean, it's hard to know exactly. I mean, so Urizen is this kind of oppressive father god sort of figure who who kind of oppressively uses in this case kind of rationality and kind of reason to kind of oppress others and to sort of enforce a kind of oppressive worldview. But he is, despite the sort of element of reason and rationality within his that he represents, he's still very much a kind of spiritual figure. This is within a kind of spiritual framework, I suppose you could say. It's spiritual psychological kind of framework that Blake is creating. And it's really so those elements that you just mentioned and quoted from my essay on Allen Ginsberg's Blakean Albion, where I'm talking about Ginsberg's relationship with the figure of Albion, which is pre-exists Blake, but which Blake also very much takes and sort of makes his own, and then sort of writing about how Ginsberg then draws on that. So that most of those elements that you drew out there that you were referring to as kind of particularly Gnostic, they're from Blake, really. I mean, this is kind of Ginsberg quoting Blake still almost. So there's a strongly Gnostic element in Blake's work. It's hard to say exactly how Blake encountered that. Partly, I mean, and I am well aware that the term Gnostic and Gnosticism is a kind of contested term,
Yes.
as you know, and so many of your guests have mentioned over the years as well. And but if we take a kind of basic element of what we're describing as Gnosticism, to be this idea of the demiurge of Gnosticism and the kind of myth of Adam and Eve being trapped within the Garden of Eden, and all of that. If we kind of take, which is, of course, is just one element of some traditions that we've sometimes called Gnostic,
Yes.
but if we kind of take that as as a kind of central element of something that can be usefully called Gnosticism, Blake somehow comes across these ideas, and it may be that they just emerge from his reading of the Bible, because many of these Gnostic elements are still there in the canonical books of the Bible, I think, and some of them, of course, are in a way that obviously expressed to their fullest extent in the in the non-canonical Gnostic books, but they're also there in the Bible, and so I think Blake's reading of the Bible, and he was so steeped in the Bible and had read it ever since as a young child, kind of continuously. I think he may have just independently, to some extent, kind of read the Bible a little bit against the grain, as is part of the sort of Gnostic technique almost, and sort of come to a sort of Gnostic understanding of things, partly independently of any external kind of influence from actual sort of knowledge of Gnostic tradition. But he was also, Blake obviously clearly also had some knowledge of Jewish Kabbalah and of those kind of Jewish mystical traditions, and so he may have absorbed some kind of Gnostic ideas partly through that as well. Although even his knowledge of the Kabbalah would have been very much the kind of Christian Kabbalah, right, or the sort of a particular version of that. But in any case, there's a strong connection between Blake's thought and Gnosticism. But what I'm interested in, in the presentation that I gave at the S-Way conference in Amsterdam a few years ago, is the way in which Ginsberg is also interested in Gnosticism, not only through Blake, but actually had also independently read Gnostic material on Gnosticism from quite early on, from around the same time as Blake Vision. I think he'd first come across. He had a teacher at Columbia called Raymond Weaver, who's a literature professor, expert on Moby Dick, and who had sort of expressed an idea that Melville that Moby Dick itself had a sort of Gnostic element, and Melville was interested in Gnosticism actually in the late 19th century, and so Weaver was a Melville scholar who was one of Ginsberg's tutors at Columbia, professors at Columbia, and sort of seems to have turned Ginsberg on to Gnosticism a little bit while Ginsberg was still a student, so around the time of the Blake Vision. And then later on, Ginsberg read Hans Jonas's book, The Gnostic Religion. And it seems like that text was very much at the core of Ginsberg's understanding of Gnosticism. And it seems like even though Jonas's book, because of the kind of the way in which the Nag Hammadi discoveries, and that was also from the mid 1940s, 1945 was when Nag Hammadi texts were unearthed in Egypt. These Gnostic texts, because of the way in which it took a very long time for the Nag Hammadi text to actually be published and for there to be knowledge of them, even though they'd been dug up in 1945. Ginsberg's reading of Hans Jonas and of early kind of scholarly work on Gnosticism although it was post 1945, it didn't actually include very much from Nag Hammadi. So Ginsberg was probably quite out of date in some ways in his kind of reading of Gnosticism, and also Hans Jonas has a very particular perspective on Gnosticism, which is quite far from later kind of scholarly perspectives on it. But nonetheless, it's fascinating how Ginsberg really becomes very fascinated by Gnosticism, and he's aware of, he's interested obviously in the connections to Blake as well, but he kind of starts to read Gnostic texts and academic texts on Gnosticism separately to Blake as well, separately to his Blakean interests as well. Yeah, I mean, you meant so. This is something that he's doing throughout his life, as I said, from the 40s onwards, but it seems to be particularly in the 1970s, for whatever reason, that the Ginsberg really kind of re-engages or more closely engages with Gnosticism. And he, so 1978, he writes this poem called Plutonian Ode, and it's an interesting poem because it's very Ginsberg in the way that it's partly an anti-nuclear poem. Actually, it comes out of his work on opposing a nuclear weapons factory in Boulder, Colorado, which was where he was partly living at that time because he'd founded this Buddhist university, the Naropa Institute, in Boulder. So he and the other faculty and students at Naropa were very much involved in this very active anti-nuclear campaign, which was sort of on their doorstep. And so he writes this poem which is directed at the element of plutonium. It's kind of addressed to the element in a way, and it's kind of spiritualizing, you could say, the element of plutonium, and it's associating it, as its name suggests, with the god Pluto, and so the poem is called Plutonian Ode rather than Plutonium Ode, which is a big of it, but anyway, but it's and it's so it kind of Ginsberg's poem draws on Gnosticism as a kind of way. In a way, it's the poem is almost sort of like, it's addressed to the element of plutonium, and it's kind of, you could almost say it's kind of wanting to quite aggressively satirize and criticize and sort of, it's almost like, it's hard to explain it, but to sort of attack to reveal, I suppose, Ginsberg would have said, kind of to reveal the sort of true identity of this element, and to sort of politicize it and spiritualize it, and so he there's a section of the poem, I've got it here, where he's addressing plutonium, and Ginsberg writes, "Radioactive nemesis, were you there at the beginning? Black, dumb, tongueless, unsmelling blast of disillusion. I manifest your baptismal word after 4 billion years. I guess your birthday in earthling night. I salute your dreadful presence, lasting, majestic as the gods." And then he makes reference to different Gnostic and esoteric kind of gods. So then he says, majestic as the gods, Sabaoth, Jehovah, Astaphaeus, Adonais, Elohim, Io, Yaldabaoth, Aeon from Aeon, born ignorant in an abyss of light, Sophia's reflections, glittering, thoughtful galaxies, whirlpools of star spume, silver thin as hairs of Einstein. So he's very directly referencing the Gnostic demiurge Yaldabaoth, and he's kind of somehow wanting to associate the element of plutonium with Yaldabaoth, which is is interesting. And this partly came out of, so Ginsberg had actually met and also corresponded with Gershom Scholem, the very well-known, almost sort of founding figure of kind of academic study of Jewish mysticism, and obviously Gnosticism kind of plays into that, or is connected to that. And I think Ginsberg had kind of I think he may have first met Scholem much earlier in the 60s, but I think he began corresponding with Scholem in the late 70s, and as part of his own sort of individual kind of research on esoteric subjects, I suppose. He loved to write to people and talk to people. I think he just got in touch with Scholem and sort of said, "Remember me? Hey, I'm researching Gnosticism. Have I got this right?" And so that was partly where this poem came out of. So it's it's an interesting poem because there are Blakean elements in different parts of the poem, but mostly it's kind of using Gnosticism separately to Blake, which is kind of interesting, given that a large part of Ginsberg's kind of esoteric interests are sort of channeled through Blake. So this is sort of elements that's partly not channeled through Blake, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, I thought it was an incredibly powerful poem, and it's taunting this this element of plutonium / Yaldabaoth, saying, "I dare your reality, I challenge your very being, I publish your cause and effect, I turn the wheel of mind on your 300 tons. Your name enters mankind's ear. I embody your ultimate power." So it's like he's almost taking the power away from.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a sort of a spell, you could say.
Yes.
I mean, it is. It is a magical working, really. I mean, it's
Indeed,
very interesting. Yeah. So he had actually. I mean, I just to complete that thought on Ginsberg and Gnosticism.
Sure.
He was very. I mean, obviously, this is using Gnosticism in relation to an anti-nuclear and anti-war poem. It's not, the campaign was against a nuclear weapons facility, so it wasn't even just against nuclear power. This is very much part of a kind of Cold War,
Yes.
anti-nuclear weapons sort of context. And so he's connecting Gnosticism to politics, and to the anti-war movement. And this is something that he's very interested in doing, actually. And so a little bit earlier to this, in the early 70s, he'd recorded an album of settings of Blake's songs of innocence and experience. And Ginsberg, as well as being friends with Dylan and other musicians, did produce some music himself and some recordings. And on the sleeve notes to his 1970 album of Blake's songs, Ginsberg has this passage there in the sleeve. I mean, they're pretty unusual sleeve notes, but where he's again referencing Gnosticism, but where he is connecting it very much to the kind of contemporary reality. And he mentions he actually sort of connects Yaldabaoth with Richard Nixon. So, do you mind if I read a couple of sentences from that? So Ginsberg writes, "In beginning, the Word," and then in brackets he writes, "Sophia, Mother Wisdom, Knowledge, Tirzah." Tirzah is one of Blake's kind of mythological characters. "Flash imagined all aeons down to Jehovah's garden. The serpent was the caller of the great call, disguised messenger from the abyss of light, according to the Mandaean Gnostic heresy suppressed around 313 AD Rome, when Constantine Emperor," and then Ginsberg writes in brackets, CIA, "accepted Christ, took over religion and suppressed revolutionary hypnostic illumination of the fake authority of the material universe itself. The Roman state co-opted religion at Council of Nicaea and burned all dissenting metaphysical doctrines. This established the satanic state, presently headed by Richard Nixon, Jehovah in disguise, forgetting to whom he is beholden, son of Elohim, descendant of Yaldabaoth, only a flash of Sophia's consciousness, herself a flash of self-consciousness in the infinite abyss of light." So, yeah, I just love the way in which he's bringing Gnosticism and contemporary American politics together like that.
It's very syncretic in that regard. He's really blending a lot of different things. And also, would you say that Ginsberg was a bricoleur, that he kind of picked different elements out that seemed to fit and work for him, and kind of, melding them and assimilating them?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a sort of element to Ginsberg's actual written style, which connects to bricolage, I suppose. From that passage that I just read, you can hear how he's actually missing out certain words, certain articles, it's missing the and sometimes, and sort of so there's a way in which he's sort of, in a way, is quite kind of heavy message, complex language, but also mixed in with phrases like revolutionary hypnostic illumination, and kind of bringing it all together. So that there is an element to his later kind of style, almost, I think, which fits with what you're saying there about bricolage. I think there are possibly other beats who you could see as kind of more connected to something like that. And earlier on I just mentioned Burroughs and his cut-up technique. And I mean, Ginsberg was there when Burroughs and Brian Geisen were experimenting with cut-up in the 1950s in Paris. They were all living together in the Beat Hotel, as it came to be known in Paris. So Ginsberg was very much part of promoting and helping Burroughs to get published as well. So he was part of all all of this. But I think maybe other poets of the time who are more clearly kind of bricolage like in their technique. But yeah, Ginsberg was also a kind of a magpie for information, for sure. I mean, however he worked that into his poetry or not, he was just a kind of voracious reader of all sorts of different kinds of texts and interested in all sorts of different philosophical and literary and political things as well. And he did a huge amount of research on, for example, this is kind of taking things down a different track, but on the CIA's involvement in the heroin trade in Southeast Asia at the time of the Vietnam War, and nobody really was researching that at the time, and it turned Ginsberg turned out to be right that there were all sorts of underhand kind of things going on, in terms of that element of the drug trade in that period where America was involved in all of that. And yeah, he did some pretty serious research on all of that, and I think he even had a bet with the head of the CIA that he was right or something. Whether by letter, he loved to write to people.
Yeah, it's very clear learning more about Ginsberg that his range of interest, his topics were very broad in that regard. Another interesting bit of information that you talk about in your work is that we've already mentioned Buddhism, of course, that he was interested in that, but that he saw Buddhism and Gnosticism as being connected. Can you explain this in more detail? And this might then, come back into this whole syncretic type of argument. But
yeah, so I think, first of all, it's interesting that Ginsberg is not the only person to have made these kind of connections between Buddhism and Gnosticism. And it might at first kind of seem like a strange sort of connection to make, but I think something that Ginsberg himself was aware of, and which various scholars have also pointed out, is just how interconnected the ancient world was, and just how that there would have been historically connections between the Near East and Europe and North Africa and all of the different religious spiritual traditions and India, in that ancient world, and this was totally a time in which it's very possible and likely that Buddhists may have interacted with Gnostics, and of course they also did in Manichaeism, for example, which seems to be almost this kind of syncretic religion that definitely brought together those two elements alongside others. So Ginsberg was aware that historically it's quite possible that there would have been connections across the ancient world, but I think in parts, these were just two different kind of religious traditions that he was interested in, so he wanted to kind of find connections between them. But I think it kind of makes sense. I think what sort of makes sense in terms of Ginsberg's perspective on this is this idea that Gnosticism is sort of less concerned with sort of sin and repentance in a way that more mainstream Christianity perhaps is, and more concerned with something more like individual enlightenment. And so that does seem to kind of connect to Buddhism. That seems to I think, so I think I think that was sort of where Ginsberg was coming from. And it's interesting that so as I said, most of Ginsberg's knowledge of Gnosticism actually seems to have come from sort of earlier scholarship, and I haven't found any evidence that Ginsberg really updates his reading of academic work on Gnosticism through the kind of late 70s as the Nag Hammadi texts start to be published. Even though this was the period where Ginsberg was kind of getting back into Gnosticism, I haven't actually found evidence that he was reading the latest work on Gnosticism. But so he doesn't seem, for example, have read Elaine Pagels, who, even though she was writing in the late 70s, exactly when he was getting into Gnosticism again. But in the Gnostic Gospels, in Pagels' kind of famous, popularizing text on Gnosticism from I think it's from 79, Pagels herself also very clearly kind of makes this link or kind of speculates about connections again between Gnosticism and Buddhism. So she writes, instead of coming to save us from sin, this is talking about Jesus, instead of coming to save us from sin, he comes as a guide who opens access to spiritual understanding within Gnosticism. She's saying sort of in contrast to a sort of, as I said, a kind of sin and repentance type interpretation. And she says, does not such teaching the identity of the divine and human, the concern with illusion and enlightenment, the founder who is represented not as a lord but as a spiritual guide, sound more Eastern than Western? Could Hindu or Buddhist tradition have influenced Gnosticism? So she was having the same, it's kind of interesting to me that she was having the same thoughts at the same time as Ginsberg independently. And, I'm not saying that Ginsberg was a scholar in the same way as someone like Elaine Pagels, but it's just interesting that in his own independent sort of way he was coming to some similar conclusions.
Well, even if you're just looking at it more just on a kind of a superficial level, Buddhism talks about that this world is an illusion. About, you mentioned before about non-attachment, that the physical world really isn't the goal, I guess, in the end. You have to kind of bypass the physical to get to the spiritual. Gnosticism, kind of the basic tenets is that the physical body is corrupt, that we have to renounce the physical world and focus our attention on the spiritual, because that's the true reality. You can kind of start to see some similarities, and I don't want to generalize, but like I said, if you're just looking very superficially, you might start to think, hey, these ideas kind of sound like they're similar in a way.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and I should probably mention that so by this time, by the 70s, Ginsberg had become a Buddhist as well. So he had taken vows, in the I think 1971 in Tibetan Buddhism. So he became friends with and sort of follower of Chogyam Trungpa, and part of that Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And interestingly, kind of remained close to Trungpa despite all of Trungpa's the scandals around him. I don't know if you know about that, but this actually connected. That this did actually even kind of influence Ginsberg's. Some of the other poets who Ginsberg was connected to in that period had their own kind of difficult run-ins with Chogyam Trungpa, and there was a whole. Political, you could say political kind of thing to all of that. But yeah, Ginsberg, he was always interested in, even when he became a Buddhist, he was interested in connecting that obviously to his Jewish roots. Described himself as a sort of Jewish Buddhist. He was interested in connecting it to Gnosticism as he read about Gnosticism. And he was interested in connecting Buddhism and Blake as well. So I think with the sort of complicated elements of Blake's prophetic books, where Blake has these so many different figures who are sort of like deities, you might call them, or different representations of different spiritual elements or mental elements, and they all interact with each other, and they have kind of complex relationships with each other, and sometimes they represent different elements, sometimes different directions, the cardinal directions, and all of this kind of fits together in a complicated way. And Ginsberg saw quite clearly that even though I don't think this was an influence on Blake, he saw that you could quite easily connect this to like a sort of Tibetan mandala, where you have the four directions and you have the different deities kind of interacting with each other. And he was, he could see how you could almost have a kind of Tibetan Buddhist reading of Blake, I suppose you could say.
Right,
you could if you were into that quite complex kind of flowery Buddhist tradition, with all the different deities and demons, and that you could kind of use that to help understand this equally complex and world that Blake had created, and you could sort of use it as a, even if it's just to sort of open your mind into to a particular way of thinking, that you could almost use Tibetan Buddhism if you had knowledge of that, as a way to help read Blake, because he was, for whatever reason, just kind of using some similar kind of techniques. Yeah.
It seems quite clear that Ginsberg put a lot of thought into all of these different systems that he was interested in, and tried to make some sense of it, I guess, for himself. That was, I guess, most important for him, that it made sense for him. But yeah, I guess with he was a creative guy, he just to put it very simply. So it doesn't surprise me that he in his own worldview, that he would take all these different elements and then have a certain type of logic that connected them together. So that's for me not super surprising. I just felt that as I really didn't know that much about Ginsberg's background, that all of these more, I guess, what you could label esoteric influences had a big role, which I don't know, maybe if you can speak to this, if Ginsberg's esoteric interests, if he kind of was the outsider in that regard. I mean, I know that Burroughs was also interested in occult ideas, but like I said, this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. It's not really my area of specialty, so I'm not really certain as to the importance of esoteric thought in the general beat poet movement. If you can say something about that.
I would say that different forms of esoteric thought were really crucial to most of the beats, but also, as I said earlier, to the in a way that the beats existed within a broader grouping of sometimes called the New American poetry, which included a lot of poets who, in different ways, were became perhaps associated with counterculture or not, but who certainly saw themselves as, even just in strictly kind of poetic terms, kind of rebelling against a more restrictive form of more academic kind of poetry, I suppose. And so within this kind of broader grouping that Ginsberg was also kind of part of, some of whom might have described themselves as beats, but many of them didn't, and beat itself became a very contested term. And even Kerouac himself, who possibly was the originator of the term, later had problems with it, or had different kind of ideas about what it really meant or what it didn't mean, and who was a beat and who wasn't, and it's the whole terminology around beat is a whole other subject in itself. But yeah, many of these poets, if we're looking at poetry and literature, we're deeply into all different esoteric systems, and some, all from different kind of angles and different ways in which they'd got into it as well. I mentioned a poet called Robert Duncan earlier on. Robert Duncan had grown up in a theosophist household. He'd grown up with parents who were theosophists, so clearly he was going to end up kind of bringing lots of esoteric stuff into his poetry.
Exactly.
And Ginsberg with his Jewish background, although his parents were more kind of into socialism and communism, than they were, the Kabbalah. Still he had a Jewish esoteric background available there, at least to to kind of draw on. So no, definitely. And I mean, you've had as a guest Tommy Cowan talking about Burroughs and Gnosticism, and
exactly.
And I really liked the way that he sort of Cowan uses this term archontic to kind of refer to a kind of key element of Gnosticism, around this idea of the archons, these kind of figures who are sort of control the rulers, who are kind of controlling the world, and that almost kind of, I suppose you could say, more paranoid kind of element to Gnosticism, was obviously something that fit very well with Burroughs's worldview, and and Ginsberg, I suppose, generally was much more upbeat and kind of lighter, kind of more optimistic, I suppose you might say.
I think
perspective on things, than
definite difference in approaching it, the way they viewed it. I think, I think Burroughs was a little bit more, and because he talked about possession, and he talked about, there's like, it seemed to be a little darker in nature. But also the magical element of the cut up technique,
exactly.
that's
a magical technique as well. And I was talking earlier about Ginsberg's poem Plutonian Ode, this 1978 poem, as partly a kind of a spell, almost a kind of binding spell on the element of plutonium. But Ginsberg had already, in the 1960s, he'd already written, so he wrote a poem in 1965 called Wichita Vortex Sutra, which again is you could see as a sort of using language to create some sort of magic which would influence politics, and this is a poem which is about the Vietnam War, and which is also a kind of intervention into the Vietnam War in a poetic, political, countercultural way, but also in a way in a sort of magical way. He actually there's a section of the poem where he kind of symbolically or magically declares the end of the Vietnam War. I here declare the end of war, he says, and the idea is that that he can somehow sort of harness language to create some sort of real world magical effect.
Invoking his will and putting that out there into the world. That's one way of looking at magic. It's enforcing your will upon on a situation. So definitely very, very interesting. Very interesting stuff that you're talking about here. You've already mentioned that Ginsberg was attempting to achieve a Blakean revival in general with everything that he was doing within the these decades that he was writing his own poetry, of course, but with the music and with the other meetings that he would have with other people, other gatherings, and all the number of different things that he was involved with. In your opinion, how successful was Ginsberg in his efforts to ignite this Gnostic / Buddhist / Blakean ideal within the popular society, the contemporary culture? Can we see any evidence of other artists within this same time period and even today? Artists, authors, musicians, kind of like the whole lot, if under the header of art, who are now carrying on the torch, so to speak.
Well, I mentioned the idea of Blake spotting earlier on, and just sort of finding Blake wherever you look, and that's, I think that gets easier and easier. Blake does really seem to have escaped from in his lifetime, where he was so unknown outside a very small circle, and then through different periods where he was perhaps kind of popular within different countercultural or esoteric sort of circles, and there have been different times where Blake has certainly been very unpopular within the academy as well, and within sort of academic study of English literature, where Blake has been very out of fashion as well. And he's definitely seen, in recent years, probably post 1960s, Blake has definitely escaped from all of those bounds, and he's kind of everywhere you look, really. So just focusing on Blake, I mean, there are different figures who are kind of, you could almost associate with a kind of post-beat movement. I mean, I'm thinking of someone like Patti Smith, who was very, who's good friends with Ginsberg and with Dylan and with other beats, and who has very much continued to carry a sort of beat Blake torch onwards, and she wrote a preface to a collection of Blake's work just recently, actually, as well.
Okay.
And there's a spoken word artist called Kay Tempest, British artist who's very, very much influenced by Blake currently. Younger generation. But yeah, I mean, Blake. The more you look for Blake, and there have been several very popular studies of Blake recently as well that have been written, sort of, on the boundary between academia and kind of popular writing, I suppose. There's an author called John Higgs, who also lives here in Brighton, actually, where I live, who just recently wrote a very very popular kind of author, partly biographical, but partly sort of just popular study of William Blake that was very very widely read and very, very widely reviewed. In terms of the sort of the broadening it beyond the ongoing process of Blake's kind of popularization and Blake's kind of taking the Blakean takeover, as Blake's aphorisms just spread out into the popular culture and the ether to the extent that we don't even realize they're coming from Blake. I mean, I'm interested in the way in which, in the current, as I know you are, in the current period of right now, our own contemporary period, that esotericism has become so much more. There's so much more interest in all different aspects of esotericism, and that's and all. I mean, I'm also interested in the sort of what you might describe as a sort of darker side of that, and the way in which it feeds into the right wing as well, and QAnon and all of that. And I can see ways in which obviously a kind of Gnostic, Archontic view of reality fits quite closely with that. I'm sure that is absolutely not what Ginsberg would have wanted, because Ginsberg was very much on the left of politics. But other figures, we think of someone like Burroughs. Burroughs' kind of own politics, were probably quite a bit more complicated, than that. And then if we look at Kerouac, didn't last that long. Unfortunately died at the end of the 60s. But Kerouac's politics really were not actually left-wing at all. I mean, Kerouac actually, partly I think just because he wanted to annoy the other beats and he wanted to kind of do his own thing. But, he was a supporter basically of the Vietnam War, and, he was... he had a whole other perspective on the world going on, right. Despite being close friends with Ginsberg, lifelong, buddies, but and of course Kerouac had. I don't think Kerouac had so much of an interest in Blake, but of course he had a strong interest in Buddhism, and. Yeah, so I mean, I'm interested in the where we are in the current kind of moment in terms of different esoteric ideas that have sort of spread in interesting directions, both within within literature, but also and music and other kind of popular culture, but also within sort of the kind of dark counterculture that's that has kind of emerged in recent years as well.
Yeah, with the conspiracy theories and things like that. And what I find interesting is how present esoteric ideas are, regardless of what side you're on, or if it's a little darker, or if it's a little bit more, easily received, that it's just so prevalent, and that people don't even realize that that's what it is. And of course, that's the term occulture, that it's just everywhere. It is just, people just take it for granted that it's there. And I think that you can see it now clearly, that this there's like a renewed interest in everything esoteric and occult, whereas in the past years that was kind of poo-pooed, and let's not make any popular shows about it or popular series of books about it or make any music with references to it. There was kind of a lull in popular culture for a period of time, and now there's just this resurgence. It's like everywhere you look, there's a new whatever you're looking at. There's just something new with all of these, esoteric / occult influences, and I like looking at all of that. I like looking at the kind of the weird stuff and the fringe stuff, but you don't even really have to look there to find it. You can look at the most normal, quote unquote, normal thing and find it. So I just, I like talking about that. I like thinking about that. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about shows, I'm a big fan of Stranger Things, and, I mean, because I haven't found any Blake, I don't think, in Stranger Things, although I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's there. But of course, there is the count, even though it's it's so much about 80s nostalgia, rather than kind of 60s or 70s, there is clearly a kind of countercultural element there. Not only with the the sort of MK Ultra sort of references and all of that, but also like funny little things like Winona Ryder herself. You know that she's the daughter of Michael Horowitz, who was Timothy Leary's archivist and kind of personal assistant, and she grew up around Ginsberg. Ginsberg was a family friend. But
wasn't Timothy Leary her godfather?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, she was totally in that environment.
It just fits perfectly that she should be playing a character in this series.
Exactly. Wonderful. Now, I understand that you have a book that you're working on, and I don't know how close you are to publishing it yet, but can you share a bit about it? And
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I finished my PhD 7 years ago now, and I've been, I've been trying to publish a version of it ever since, and I've sort of encountered the same thing that many people coming to the end of their PhDs, in recent years, have, just how difficult it is to basically to get an academic job. And so I'm actually currently working outside of academia, although I've continued to publish since my PhD, and many of the publications that are there on academia.edu are actually things that I've written since finishing the PhD. But yeah, I'm so my book, which is a kind of version of the PhD, but reframed. It's called William Blake and Allen Ginsberg: Romanticism, Counterculture, and Radical Reception. So it covers a lot of the things that we've just been talking about. It doesn't have a release date yet, and as I said, in part that really is just because currently I actually do not have very much time to work on it, which is a real shame. But yeah, that's how life is. And,
I understand. Well, I'll just have to be patient along with everybody else. So okay, well, that's good to know that it's going to be coming sometime in the future.
It is.
Okay.
And in the meantime, as you've mentioned, I have quite a range of different articles and chapters which have been published in different books and academic journals, but which I've just put up on academia.edu so that they can achieve a bit of a wider audience.
Of course, there's plenty to read. So how can people find you on the internet? Say they want to contact you because they have a lovely little anecdote that they want to share with you, or whatever.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm as we said, I'm on academia.edu. I'm on Twitter still, despite everything. So I'm on Twitter at Dr. Luke Walker, and that's about it. I'm not on Facebook, but you can get in touch with me pretty easily. Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll just hope that Twitter doesn't implode anytime in the near future.
I think you can find how to contact me through academia.edu as well.
Exactly. Okay. Well, Luke, I want to thank you so much for sharing all of these insights with me today. I really found this discussion so interesting, and just a learning experience for me as well. And it clearly shows the influence of esotericism and esoteric ideas in culture with the figure of Allen Ginsberg.
Many thanks. Thanks, Stephanie. It was great to talk to you too.
Well, I'd like to wish you all the best for the holidays in the new year. And yeah, we'll just keep in touch with each other as we have been doing through Twitter. We'll just keep our fingers crossed that Twitter is going to survive, and we'll just carry on.
Thanks. Yeah, and I love your show. I really, you've had some great guests over the.
Thank you. I really appreciate your support. You're always one of the people on Twitter that's always reposting things and putting.
I like to comment on ones that I particularly enjoy. Yeah. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, and thank you again for talking with me today.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Bye.
I hope you've enjoyed this discussion with Dr. Luke Walker. My thanks again to Luke for his work and for making the time to talk with me. Please check out the links in the program notes for articles, a detailed list of Luke's publications, as well as some other resources that you might be interested in. I can hardly believe that we're already nearing the end of 2022. Time certainly flies by when you're doing what you love. I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to all of you out there who listen to the podcast and watch my YouTube videos, plus, of course, all of my wonderful guests over this past year. I couldn't have done any of this without all of you. Wishing you all a wonderful and joyful holiday season and a prosperous new year. See you in 2023.